Good to see you once again as we take a look at Chapter 25, Part 2, as we continue investigating life in the 1920s, this time looking at different fears and the United States policy of isolationism. After World War I, and resulting from the fear caused by the Russian Revolution after Lenin installs communism inside of Russia, there became what was known as the Red Scare. And what this was kind of the fear of the spread of communism to around the world and even to the United States. And so this fear will have a multitude of effects both on our foreign policy and domestic affairs as we try to maybe limit the number of immigrants coming in because they might have radical beliefs. And as we kind of look to, maybe limit the power of unions because we're fearful that they're trying to overthrow the capitalistic system. So we see many different ways that this fear of communism kind of shows itself in the U.S. And part of that fear played out because the workers of the U.S. had put off, economic gains and issues that they had at work during World War I, in an attempt to try to help the U.S. win this war. Well, after the war, they're ready to kind of reap some of the benefits. And after some of the controls of government are lifted, we kind of see workers losing a little ground when it comes to the economy. And so we see a bunch of strikes take place in 1919, including the Boston police strike and the steel and coal strikes. But if you couple the strikes with this fear of communism, people kind of started seeing these two go hand in hand. And so there's this kind of anti-union feeling that kind of became pervasive throughout the U.S. And businesses started to try to act against unions and try to limit their power, whether it be having employees sign yellow dog contracts or implement more welfare capitalism, which is kind of like improving conditions themselves in different ways. But what we see is that there's this backlash against organized labor, and therefore union membership drops from about 5 million to 3 million by the end of the decade. However, part of that drop could also be the fact that the conservative union leaders, feared unionizing the unskilled laborers, as most of these unions attempted to only unionize skilled laborers, and many new workers coming to the U.S. were unskilled laborers. And so for different reasons then, we do see a decline in that union membership. And as the, kind of anti-communist, anti-socialist, kind of this fear of the anarchists, that might be coming to America, we see those fears play out in what becomes known as the Palmer raids. As the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, kind of leads the assault on, the alien and radical threat. Anybody who is a possible, problem or radical for the U.S., and as a recent immigrants, might be actually kicked out or deported back to the country from which they came, therefore trying to keep America safe from these alien influences. Now, two of these immigrants that got caught up in the hysteria were Sacco and Vanzetti. And these two men were accused of robbery and murder in Massachusetts. Now, being the fact that they were Italian immigrants, which is Southern Europe, they were admitted anarchists, and even dodged the draft in World War I, they kind of had the cards stacked against them. And when it was all said and done after their trial, they were actually found guilty and sentenced to death, even though the evidence was very circumstantial. Now, today historians kind of say, one of the men, but most likely not both of them, were guilty, and yet they were both executed for these crimes, kind of showing, these fears in America towards these immigrants and anarchists and radicals. And so as it plays out, kind of as part of this backlash and growth in fears as well during this era, we see the growth of the KKK, or the kind of the rebirth of the KKK. However, during this time in the 1920s, they didn't just go after African Americans, but they attacked anyone who kind of seemed different from them, including Jews, Catholics, immigrants, and even women. And so you do see the Klan kind of grow in power and even elect some members to government positions. But really, they kind of think that they're defending America and keeping it safe from these beliefs and radical ideas. Just kind of again heightening and furthering those tensions. However, if we can kind of turn our attention, if we may, to politics a little bit here, and what becomes known as kind of the Republican decade, as Warren G. Harding leads kind of 3 Republican presidents of this decade in what he says is kind of an attempt to return to normalcy, or kind of the old traditional Republican priorities. And therefore, Harding kind of looks to kind of turn away from the kind of that progressive era that dominated before World War I, and he looks to kind of instill some of those old Republican tenets that we'll take a look at here. But when we look at his cabinet, probably one of the top appointments he made was Andrew Mellon as Secretary of Treasury, who kind of oversaw this business boom in which, the middle and upper classes benefited the most, but we do see a lowering of taxes for everyone. We do see businesses booming, and the belief of what was good for business is kind of good for everyone, kind of the trickle-down idea a little bit, I guess. But we also see some not-so-good appointments, like the Ohio Gang, which were Harding's kind of poker-playing buddies and cronies, which, well, actually some of them will cause, kind of corruption and problems for Harding. And one of those is Elbert B. Fall as the Secretary of the Interior, who was really the chief figure in the Teapot Dome scandal. What this scandal involved was where Fall illegally leased oil fields to private companies, and in return he kind of got a kickback, made money off the deal. Well, as this and other, kind of corrupt charges and, political abuses kind of happen in Harding's administration, it really eventually takes a toll on his health, and he will actually pass away while still in office. But looking at some of the more specific policies of Harding's administration, we kind of see that this era kind of saw a return to isolationism, whether it be economically, politically, or socially. And here, we kind of see the feeling of kind of not wanting to join the League of Nations, which we don't. Something that we've discussed before. But part of that isolationist feeling is we don't want to get involved in other countries' affairs and problems because it could drag us back into another war. And therefore, some people, didn't want to join the League of Nations, which without us in it, it wasn't going to be as strong as it could have been if we were a part of the League. Furthermore, we isolated ourselves kind of economically. With the Ford and E. McCumber tariff of 1922, we kind of returned to the old Republican policy of high protective tariffs. We're trying to keep out foreign products so that people buy American products. And that kind of helps fuel that economic boom a little bit because people are purchasing, albeit it might be with credit, but we're still kind of moving products. And this consumer society kind of does take off and prosper. And then we also isolate ourselves kind of socially by limiting the number of immigrants that could come into the United States. And like I said, kind of we've talked about the old and new immigrants before, and this anti-immigrant feeling led to the passage of different anti-immigrant acts, including the 1921 National Origins Act, which severely limited the number of immigrants that could come into the United States each year, based off of a population, a percent of a population that had lived here before. Now, it was really aimed at trying to keep out the Southern and Eastern Europeans, but it restricted tremendously the flow of these immigrants, with the exception of Mexico, which the act didn't apply to. And as you can see then, the effect of some of these policies did severely limit the number of people coming into the U.S. You can see from 1921 to 1930 how far it had dropped from the early 1900s, And then in the 1930s with the Great Depression, it even drops further. But part of that anti-immigrant feeling did come from the strong nativist feeling, which you can kind of see some of the reasons for that. Kind of a patriotic feeling after World War I. Kind of pride in our culture and our government. Want to try to keep it pure. It could be, like I said before, with religious reasons. Kind of an anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish feeling. Maybe it was also the fear that these urban centers were becoming crowded and run down, and trying to improve them by keeping people from moving in, and therefore keep people from competing for jobs. And kind of like what we started with, the Red Scare, this fear of communism, socialism, anarchist thoughts and feelings. And because of all that, we kind of look at these isolationist policies, started with Harding, but carried on through as well with these other presidents, of which we'll be taking a look at in our next lesson.